Hello and welcome to my talk, Understanding Hegemonic Whiteness, Cultural and Historical Figurations. I'm delighted to be able to contribute to the conference building bridges. So, depending on social, cultural, and historical circumstances, whiteness becomes a constitutive component in the construction of a hegemonic social identity that helps maintain social hierarchies and inequalities based on ethnicity. Whiteness as a social and cultural identity is continuously produced and reproduced within complex cultural, historical, and social contexts, as well as intersections with other identity categories. Therefore, we must study the production of white identities in such contexts in order to gain a full understanding of racism and the role of whiteness in racism. I want to focus on various figurations of whiteness. I aim to show how such figurations form a wide ranging social imaginary that shapes our knowledges of ethnicity and produces a normative, invisible whiteness. I will demonstrate this approach by highlighting how different figurations of whiteness formed white hegemony during specific historical moments from modern Western colonialism to the present day, such as the case of the Irish versus Anglo British whiteness, the role of class, and figurations of tainted or hypervisible whiteness, such as white trash in the US and the so called chavs in the United Kingdom. I want to demonstrate how white identities have been produced historically and culturally. The use of the concept of figurations as an epistemological frame helps to come to terms with the complexities of cultural identities because, among other things, it bridges the gap between the lived material reality of cultural identities and the area of symbolic representation that shapes our cultural knowledge, such as in the media, literature, and the arts. I therefore want to show what the place of the study of figurations is within the wider project of critical whiteness studies. This leads us to questions of history and cultural representation. It is here where many of these four aspects manifest themselves and thereby symbolically reflect the materiality of racism and white hegemony. The question of history tries to address how whiteness became hegemonic in certain contexts over time. Whiteness needs to be historicized in order to deconstruct the myth that it just is and always has been a superior form of identity. The second question wants to address how whiteness and its normativity are being reiterated and manifested in cultural representation. For the first question, let us have a look at two examples, the whiteness of the Irish and the whiteness of the British working class. Both are European examples which are closely linked to a transnational history of imperialism and colonialism. Both histories lead us from the British and Irish islands to the Americas. As Steve Garner has argued, the Irish represent an ideal type to study the raising and becoming white of certain ethnic or cultural groups. To quote, from an Irish perspective, black-white paradigms of race, which neglect the mystification of whiteness and assume power lies unproblematically and equally with all whites, and new racism are hardly new. The experience of the Irish as a racialized white group vis-à-vis other more powerful white groups and less powerful others is an ideal type from which to develop arguments about the contemporary field. The making of the racial status of the Irish is linked to the racism of British imperialism as well as to the development of scientific racism in the 19th century. To quote Alistair Bonnet on the subject, in Britain, the otherness of the Irish, their status as colonial subjects rather than agents, has been marked both by their Victorian scientific identification as a lower race and by their persistent cultural representation as non-civilized and primitive, end of quote. The history of the Irish race, in inverted commas, is an important part of the reconfiguration of notions of race and class during the colonization of the Americas. To quote Steve Garner once again, there is manifestly an enduring and well developed popular notion of the Irish as constituting a race. The idea that there is such a thing is therefore not only the result of the racialization of the Irish by the British and later by American WASPs, but also the fruit of work by Irish nationalists aiming to construct a positive, that is, self defined identity in the face of the negative representation of Irishness around them. The key to positing racialized identities is to link the natural inextricably to the social, as was achieved by Enlightenment thinkers. There must therefore be two dimensions to the idea of race, a set of phenotypes that correspond to the cultural and social attributes of the Irish. This idea became more concrete as British colonialism progressed in the 17th century and onwards. As Garner observes, the idea was that Native Americans, the Irish and Africans, were linked in their shared barbarity, or at least incivility. End of quote. In order to construct themselves as a morally, culturally, and biologically superior nation and ethnicity, the English needed a racial other, which they located overseas as well as on the Irish peninsula during its Anglicization. As Garner emphasizes, the English did at first not concentrate on the body, but on culture as the site and expression of difference, therefore the key words incivility and barbarity. However, later, as you can see in this later image from the end of the 19th century, this was later reinforced through the emerging biological and evolutionary discourse of the 19th century. Here, alleged physiognomic and phenotypical evidence is constructed to argue that the Irish are closer to Africans biologically than to Anglo-Saxons. So how, to paraphrase the title of Noel Ignatius' influential book, did the Irish become white? This again has to do with the history of colonization. When Irish prisoners were sent to the colonies to work on plantations alongside African slaves, the English feared that the Irish and the Africans would form an alliance to overthrow their colonizers. So, in order to destabilize a shared identity of the colonized, they granted the Irish the status as whites, as it were, so they could feel superior to black Africans. What we can see in the example of the Irish, then, in terms of intersectionality, is the intersection of discourses and meanings surrounding race, ethnicity, class, as well as religion. The Protestant Anglo-Saxons considered themselves superior to the Catholic Irish. The becoming white of the British working class can be reconstructed along similar lines as the becoming white of the Irish. It might sound surprising today, but the working class in Britain hasn't always been identified as self-evidently white in racial terms. This is because social class strongly intersected with racialization. Like Steve Garner for the Irish, Alistair Bonnet and also Noel Ignatieff have identified imperialism as the paradigm shift for the racial identity of the working class. It was only after encounters with non-white people in the African colonies that the British working class gradually came to be perceived as white and could perceive itself as white. This came about especially in the 19th century, when those working in the colonies gradually came to enjoy privileged status. What is more, the immigration of Irish labourers to Britain complicated matters further and led to the formation of a specifically English or Anglo-British working class identity based on the notion of race. This observation is made in Cedric Robinson's influential book Black Marxism. Robinson traces the racialization of the Irish and the English working class in order to challenge the dominant Marxist notion of a coherent global working class consciousness. Robinson argues that the history of capitalism is interwoven with modern race thinking from the beginning, and that Western Marxism is an insufficient because Eurocentric approach to the history of global capitalism. Robinson therefore explores Black radicalism as a source for Black Marxism. To quote, "For whatever it is worth, it would have been inconsistent with the tenets of Anglo-Saxonism to detach the English worker from a racial hierarchy that was quite adequate in locating the deficiency of the Irish race. The Irish worker, having descended from an inferior race, so his English employers believed, the cheap market value of his labour was but its most rational form. We can therefore see that racism and the construction of a white race is part of the history of capitalism and of labor. The history of the British working class demonstrates an observation that Stuart Hall made in the 1980s in a different context. To quote, "Race is the modality in which class is lived." That still holds true today, and we can see this in some recent examples. In the summer of 2011, riots erupted in London after the fatal police shooting of an unarmed black man, Mark Duggan. The riots, which began as a peaceful protest against racist police violence, spread across the capital and over the other major cities in England. What confounded observers was that the copycat riots were not exclusively focused on that issue, and that a significant number of the rioters and looters were white. The comments of conservative historian David Starkey during an interview on BBC Newsnight during the events are telling. To quote, "A substantial section of the chavs have become black, the whites have become black, a particular sort of violent, destructive, nihilistic gangster culture has become the fashion. And black and white operate in this language together, which is this Jamaican patois that has been intruded in England. And this is why so many of us have this sense of literally a foreign country. It is about black culture. It is not skin color. It is culture." End of quote. The chavs that Starkey refers to are a phenomenon of British culture in the early 2000s. The term emerged around 2004 as a name for white lower working class youths displaying certain cultural practices such as wearing designer sportswear and behaving rudely in public. The origins of the word chav are not clear. Some claim it is an acronym for council housed and violent, others say that it is a Romani word for little kid, yet others argue that it might derive from the Indian word for tea servant, chawala. Whatever the actual origin, it becomes clear that in this term, ideas of race and class are conflated, especially in David Starkey's use of the term. It is comparable to the American term white trash, and indeed, the term white trash has been increasingly adopted in Britain from the 1990s onwards. See, for example, this interior monologue from Mark Renton, a character in Irvine Welsh's novel about Scottish working class youth train spotting, which was published in 1993. Mark Renton describes his home, the working class district Leith in Edinburgh, in Scotland, to quote, "as a place of dispossessed white trash in a country full of dispossessed white trash. Some say that the Irish are the trash of Europe. That's shite. It's the Scots. The Irish had the battle to win their country back, or at least most of it." The chavs can be found across many discursive sites and are therefore an example of how cultural figurations produce intersectional race and class identities. We can also see that this is interwoven in an international semiotics of race and class that borrows from concepts from the US to make sense of what happens in the United Kingdom. Throughout the 2000s, the chav was a ubiquitous figuration. A prominent example is the character Vicky Pollard from the comedy show Little Britain, which aired in the early 2000s, played by Mark Mataloukas. Pollard evokes notions of the white lower class as lazy, sexually promiscuous, and culturally associated with black culture, which compromises her whiteness. Pollard is what David Starkey must have had in mind when he made his infamous comments on the English riots. What this demonstrates is that certain figures become meaningful within the social imaginary. Material reality and cultural representations intersect and produce images of a group of people, which then has an effect on the lived reality of people. Such figurations therefore produce knowledge about people and their identities. Whether what a character like Vicky Pollard represents is realistic doesn't matter. It produces its own symbolic reality that in turn has material effects on actual people who might be made fun of in real life based on what can be seen in a fictional TV show. The concept of figuration enables us to take into account various spheres and discourses which form this social imaginary, of which racial identities are an integral part. In this concept, no discourse or sphere is privileged over the other. It helps to analyze and theorize the performative aspect of how identities are figured across different spheres and discourses. In other words, a filmic or literary fictional character and their racial identity are not merely an illustration of this particular identity and what it means in the real world, but it is actively shaping and interacting with wider society. Therefore, dominant ideas about certain individuals or communities can be naturalized but also challenged. Fictional figurations of identities are as much part of the semiotic world of society as everything else. The concept therefore helps to organically combine sociological and cultural studies research. I therefore draw on the sociological and anthropological use of figuration by researchers like John Hartigan Jr. Hartigan Jr. argues, to quote, that figures call attention to the way people come to consider their identities in relation to potent images that circulate within a culture. Figuration is a drastic improvement over stereotype in that it captures the active way people subjected to certain debasing images are able to inhabit them in complex ways that involve critique and elaboration. The concept of figuration is therefore more organic and versatile when it comes to describing the reciprocal effects of fictional representations in the wider society. As I have argued in my own analysis of the literary figurations of British white trash, Hartigan Jr.'s approach can be instrumental in bridging the gap between the analysis of sociological phenomena, that is, the lived and experienced reality of race identities, and the analysis of the representational and symbolic component of such phenomena in literary, film, or cultural studies. The advantage of this type of analysis is that it offers ways to understand the interplay of the symbolic and the material. It therefore enables the researcher engaging with the figurations approach to study the embodied knowledge of racialized bodies. Figures are on the one hand readable as symbolic representations of racial identities, and at the same time they are the very bodies that live and experience the reality of embodying this particular racial identity. As Claudia Castañeda argues, to quote, a figure is the simultaneously material and semiotic effect of specific practices. Understood as figures, particular categories of existence can also be considered in terms of their uses, what they body forth in return. In the example of the chavs, we can see how a hypervisible, so-called tainted whiteness, the whiteness of the excessive and unruly lower class subject, becomes a figure through which an invisible and normative whiteness can establish itself as privileged. In other words, the symbolic order within which a figure like Vicky Pollard from the comedy show Little Britain can be decoded as meaningful produces a knowledge of different forms of whiteness. In intersectional terms, the classed whiteness of the chav allows privileged middle-class whites to render themselves as invisible because unmarked by class status. The figure of the chav therefore embodies a negative knowledge about unacceptable forms of whiteness. Through such negative figurations of hypervisible whiteness, normative middle-class whiteness can be produced without having to explicitly articulate itself. More concretely, the figurations approach can, for example, help to make sense of the role of ethnicity in the London riots 2011 and of what a fictional TV show such as Little Britain has to do with this historical real life event. Now, after looking at hypervisible whitenesses, we have seen how these are constructed as undesirable forms of whiteness, and now we have to see how they serve to be a contrast to an invisible form of whiteness. The novelist Toni Morrison, with her book on whiteness in literature titled Playing in the Dark: Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, and scholar Rebecca Arnerud can be credited with having first explicitly dealt with the issue of representing whiteness as an invisible norm in Western literary texts. As Arnerud explains, to quote, whiteness operates as an unmarked racial category in many literary texts. Literary representations therefore become the symbolic backup, as it were, of what Ruth Frankenberg has called whiteness's location of structural advantage, and, to quote, a set of practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed. Toni Morrison, in a close reading of literary texts, has pointed out that whiteness is always an unspoken presence, whereas non-white characters are often explicitly racially marked. This is also echoed in British journalist Renée Edo-Lodge's recent book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. In this book, she remembers her experience of reading the Harry Potter novels and other cultural texts as a black British girl in search for characters to identify with. To quote, after 4-year-old me came to terms with the fact that I would never turn white, I found refuge in white fictional British and American characters that I could relate to. For so long, that fictional heroic character loved by so many has been assumed to be white because whiteness has been assumed to be universal. It is in film, television, and books that we see the most potent manifestations of white as the default assumption. A character simply cannot be black without a pre-warning for an assumed white audience. Black characters are considered to be unrelatable, with the exception of a handful of high-profile crossover black Hollywood stars. When casting for film and TV does take the step to cast outside of whiteness, fans repeatedly reveal their ugly side, voicing their upset, disgust, and disappointment. Fear of black characters is fear of a black planet. Edo-Lodge's argument echoes the so-called invisibility thesis in critical whiteness studies. Whiteness is at the same time invisible and universal. She illustrates this by looking at recent casting debates. When the beloved Harry Potter novels were adapted for the stage, the casting of the character Hermione Granger with a black actress was in part met with an outcry by fans of the series who claimed that even though her race was never specified in the novels as white, she was supposed to be white. Equally, rumors of the potential casting of black actor Idris Elba as the next James Bond were met with resistance from important figures associated with the Bond franchise. Former James Bond actor Roger Moore said that Bond should be English, implying that a black actor couldn't be a fitting embodiment of Englishness. A writer of the franchise argued that Elba was, to quote, a bit too street to be Bond. Like Moore, he didn't spell out race, but it was implied that street was a synonym for a specific performance of blackness that was not supposed to be rhyming with the notion of a white James Bond. The James Bond films are based on novels by Ian Fleming from the 1950s. They were set against the background of the Cold War, with James Bond being the epitome of a British post-war nationalism. The James Bond universe is therefore firmly situated in a post-imperial era of British history. Britain had just defeated Hitler together with the Allies, and there was still some trace of Churchillian grandeur in the air. Over the decades, the franchise has more or less transported this kind of spirit with various inflections. The Black Panther activist Eldridge Cleaver wrote about the James Bond phenomenon in his essay collection Soul on Ice. James Bond, offering the whites a triumphant image of themselves, is saying what many whites want desperately to hear reaffirmed. I am still the white man, lord of the land, licensed to kill, and the world is still an empire at my feet. James Bond feeds on that secret little anxiety, the psychological white backlash felt in some degree by most whites alive. Looking at the 2015 casting debate, it seems that not a lot has changed since Cleaver's observations, even when Bond's whiteness seems to remain unnamed. Bron Ware has addressed the connection of invisible whiteness and Anglo-British identity. She says that, to quote, whiteness is synonymous with Englishness, forthcoming as a hidden normative code that determines who is in or out on the basis of birth and complexion. The James Bond example shows how a specific kind of invisible whiteness, ostensibly signified as English, becomes a hegemonic formation. That whiteness is the core of this figuration is made apparent when it is challenged and threatened to be replaced by non-white representations. As Edo Lodge states, quote, white people are so used to seeing a reflection of themselves in all representations of humanity at all times that they only notice it when it's taken away from them. So to conclude, what these examples of cultural figurations of whiteness show is how whiteness today relies on figurations to reproduce itself within a social and racial imaginary. That these symbolic cultural figurations are closely connected to the lived reality of race can be seen in the way they are a continuation of historical material manifestations of race. This doesn't necessarily mean that artistic cultural representations are consciously manufactured to be, as it were, propaganda for hegemonic whiteness. A lot of the underlying ideology only becomes conscious when it is put under pressure, or as we have seen in these examples. The examples show that whiteness, like all racial identities, is not a transhistorical fixed given, but is continuously reiterated and performed. In order to critically engage with white hegemony in contemporary Western societies, it must be interrogated as a form of becoming rather than static being.